Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're going to go ahead and start so we can stay on time. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest for this evening, Tim Burton.
Thank you.
From Burton's Maplewood Farms.
That's it.
And you're talking about 1813, a sweet taste of history, I believe.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you, everyone, for allowing me to be here today. We're going to take you back in time, back to 1810, when the Flynn and Guthrie families first moved into this part of the country. It wasn't, as we all know, we didn't have counties at the time or anything like that. The connection that I have to the Flynn family is through my wife. My wife, Angie, was actually is the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of a gentleman by the name of Jacob Flynn. And Jacob Flynn and his family, along with the Guthries, came to what's now Lawrence County by way of Kentucky from Virginia. It is a story of determination, perseverance, and absolute conviction to start a new life for themselves in a new part of the country. And it's interesting, back in that time, this was all considered Indian territory. And a lot of pioneers that knew of or heard of an area opening up, in many cases what they would do, and it was very common back in that time for a family to move into Indian territory. Because what they would do is they'd come into this territory and they would make improvements to the land. And then once that line would move through a treaty, which was the Fort Wayne Treaty, moving the line from southern Indiana up to northern Indiana, they would then go to the government, the U.S. government, and say, look at the improvements we've made here. They didn't talk about the fact that they may have been squatting in the area at that time. But that was a very, very common thing for the early pioneers to do that. And that's the thing that the Flynns and the Guthries did. But they took many risks by coming into hostile territory and trying to improve the land. And again, that's where it starts off with the Flynn family. They came to this area in 1810, and a lot of the story behind them that our family is so intrigued by is the fact that the Flynns actually, like most pioneers, they were very resourceful, and they made their own sugar using the maple trees. And a lot of times you'll hear a maple producer talk about sugaring. We don't talk about making maple syrup. We don't call it mapling. We call it sugaring. And the reason for that is when we're sugaring, we're actually going through the process of making maple syrup, and then we can keep reducing it until it gets to the sugar form, until it crystallizes. And back in those days, they didn't have refrigeration, so it was much easier to get to the sugaring stage and then to preserve it and keep it and then use it at any time. You can make maple syrup out of maple sugar by simply adding water and heating it up. And typically what the pioneers would do is they would get down to a very thick, get the maple syrup down to a very, very thick, almost like a slurry, like a thick slurry, and they would put it into different types of molds, and then once the mold would cool, they'd pop it out, and they would take off any of that sugar that they needed at any time to sweeten any of the dishes or anything like that. So that's why they call it maple sugaring, opposed to mapling. And the story starts with the Flynns in terms of when there was a dispute going on between the Potawatomi Indians and the other tribes that were in southern Indiana. The Flynns set up what was then called Flynn Station or Flynn Crossing, today's Leesville, Indiana. They called it Flynn Station or Flynn Crossing. And there was a band of Potawatomi Indians that came through on March 13th, 1813. And the painting to the left here is a painting depicting that day. And this was painted by Charles Crawford in 1934. Yes, 1934, Charles Crawford painted this, and it's nothing more than a depiction of that day. We're assuming that this is Jacob Flynn, and this is his son, and this is a Guthrie man, and you can see the two Potawatomi Indians sneaking up behind him. When this attack took place, the Guthrie man was shot through the chest, through his left breast. The young boy of Jacob's was actually scalped and was mortally wounded, and he died 3 days later. Jacob was taken prisoner by the Potawatomi Indians, and he was forced into slavery. And this is just an incredible story that even I don't think Disney can spin a story quite like the story of Jacob Flynn, because he was forced to carry a kettle that they were using to sugar, because the Indians didn't have those metal implements back then. So what they did is they said, we want that, and there was also an axe that they took. And they forced Jacob to carry that metal kettle on his head and shoulders all the way to their encampment on the Wabash River to today's Prophetstown, or West Lafayette. Could you imagine traveling that far under those circumstances? And what made matters even worse is poor Jacob had to, the first night through oral history, he talked about how when they took him from Flynn Station, Flynn Crossing, they camped on this small little island on a creek called Leatherwood Creek. And maybe most of you know where Leatherwood Creek is. It's just east of Bedford off of US 50. And he talked about this. Now, of course, it wasn't called Leatherwood Creek at the time, but it was this area that they now called Leatherwood Creek. And unfortunately, Jacob had to sit there and watch them drape his young son's scalp over a willow that they had drawn out, and they were drying it over the fire that night. So, it was. I can't imagine going through something like that. The only way that Jacob saved his own life was to become useful around the encampment when they got to Prophetstown. And he was traded just like a slave, and he was not treated very well. He was served spoiled meat and was not fed very well. And he started to lose a lot of weight while he was there, and he thought that the only way that he can escape is if he acted as though he was sick. Because over the course of time, he gained some of their trust. And one of the things that he also did while he was there, and the Indians were very amused by this, he acted as though he couldn't paddle a canoe. He would actually paddle a canoe, but it would go in circles. And the Indians would have much fun with watching this white man trying to paddle a canoe. But he was doing this so that they would maybe become a little bit more complacent about him leaving or trying to escape. So he would do this, and that would amuse the Indians, and over the course of time, they became a little bit more complacent with him. He took the opportunity to complain one night about having stomach pains. And so he went to the Indian woman, and she gave him scorched corn and gave him some jerk meat. Most likely it was probably from venison and so on and so forth. And that night he went out to relieve himself, and he took that opportunity to grab the hatchet, the axe that they'd taken from the encampment, and he stole one of their canoes. And this was at night, and he made it down the Wabash River. And in some of the information that we try to share with people, when we sell our maple syrup in Chicago or anywhere else, this is an incredible story that we like to tell people. And so we've tried to compress it and put it on a little card, and everybody's going to get a little sample of maple syrup tonight. And it talks about Jacob Flynn. But it doesn't go into any detail about what actually happened, because we don't have enough room on that little card. But what I find interesting is Jacob would travel by night, and he would hide out by day in the willows and the thickets and that kind of thing. And one night he encountered another Indian encampment where he says that he could see the dogs lying around the fire. And the fire put out the light across the Wabash River all the way across to the other side. And what he was concerned with is if he went on to the other side of the river to try to skirt by the Indians, that it would possibly one of the dogs could see him and alert the rest of the Indians, and then that would be it. So what he did is he saw that there was a shadow that was cast just a little way over the bank, because the bank was high, the river was a little low. And what he chose to do was a daring thing. He actually got as close to the Indian encampment as he possibly could, and he skirted right by there without being seen. Just an incredible thing. And so he eventually made his way to today's Vincennes, and there was a fort there at the time. And Jacob got down to a mere 70 pounds by the time he made it to Vincennes. He was so weak he couldn't even get out of the canoe. The inhabitants of Vincennes had to help him out of the canoe, and they nurtured him back to health. They gave him a set of clothing, and they gave him a horse. And he made it all the way back to Flynn Crossing, Flynn Station, that same year. And that is an incredible, incredible story. So the Flynns, in my eyes, were incredibly strong people. And they had a lot of, like many pioneers, and there was a lot of, they persevered, and they had a lot of determination. And today, it's those type of stories, you know. I mean, to me, they've woven a thread of historical fabric that not only is from yesterday and today, but in the future. And we're fortunate enough to still have in our presence Jacob Flynn's descendants, close descendants. The blood of Jacob Flynn flows through these people's veins, and it thrills me to have them be a part of, not only a part of my time, but also a part of the festival that we host on our farm in Medora. And that's why the Flynns were asked to be our special guest for the beginning of the National Maple Syrup Festival. And we have the fortune of having Jacob Flynn's descendants with us tonight. We have the great, that's not very far, great granddaughter of Jacob Flynn, Catherine Flynn Williams. Catherine, if you wouldn't mind holding your hand up or standing up, please. And then we also have Ron Williams. And Ron is the great-grandson of Jacob Flynn. So Ron, if you could just hold your hand up. And and my wife's grandmother, her name is Juanita Flynn Iglin, and she couldn't unfortunately be with us tonight. And then Catherine's brother, his name is Ralph Flynn, and I've always thought very highly of Ralph ever since I was a younger kid because of just Ralph's attitude with life and that type of thing. And I always wanted to kind of get into sales, and Ralph was in that, and he always kind of encouraged me to do what I wanted to do and that type of thing. So anyway, Ralph can't be with us tonight, but there's something I want to share with everybody. During the National Maple Syrup Festival, we have all the guests go to the community of Medora, and that's where you basically enter into the festival right there. Everybody gets a wrist bracelet, and we have great bluegrass music that's playing. But I think one of the neat features about this festival is it's an educational opportunity to share some of these historical stories with the younger generation. And that's something my grandmother always told me, you know, Tim, we need to sit down, which we did. We sat down and had a video camera rolling. And then I would just ask my grandmother about her life in Ireland and about coming over to the United States and that type of thing to preserve, you know, that history. And so I can share it on with my kids. We've been making maple syrup on our farm for approximately 4 years now. It's been about approximately 4 years. But it goes back in history 200 years in Angie's family. And it was an amazing discovery when Ron Williams loaned a historical book to me. And I was upstairs in our home reading through this, and I was so excited I yelled down to Angie and I said, "You're not going to believe this. Here's historical proof that the Flynns were directly associated with making maple sugar." And there we have the connection, and that we share that now. And now I notice on the internet that people are actually writing about it. They're blogging about it, or they're tweeting about it, and that type of thing. We sell our maple syrup at various farmers markets around the state. The Bloomington Farmers Market, the Indianapolis Winter Market, the Broad Ripple Farmers Market, and then the Chicago Farmers Market. We were invited to be a producer or a vendor up at the Chicago Farmers Market in downtown Chicago in Lincoln Park last year. And it's a farmer's market that's very difficult to get into. We are the only maple syrup producer in that market, which surprises me that they had no other maple syrup producer up there, being so close to Wisconsin and Michigan. Those are two states that produce a lot of maple syrup. Interestingly enough, in terms of production, Indiana led the nation in maple syrup production in 1916. We led the nation in maple syrup production because most people think of Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut as the leading producers, which they are. I mean, now they are the leading producers, but we led the nation in 1916. And my theory, this is just my theory is the reason we kind of fell off the maple radar is because of industrialization and deforestation. But I think it's more industrialization than anything. I think if anybody here has ever made maple syrup, you know how difficult it is as far as labor intense. It's very, very labor intense, especially when you're collecting it with buckets and then the process of cooking it down. Most producers use wood to fire their evaporators. And so I think what happened is a lot of these kids that were on the farm just decided, hey, you know what? I'd rather work in the factory. I can do better, I can make more money for my family that way. So I think that's one of the things that had an effect on Indiana kind of falling off the maple radar. But we hope to change that soon. I had a gentleman from Vermont approach me at the Chicago Farmers Market, and he said, Tim, would you like to take a guess on how much, on a percentage basis, the state of Vermont spends on promoting Vermont maple syrup? And I said, well, I'm going to go high. I said, you're talking about the entire tourism budget? He said, yes. I said, I'm going to go high and say 30%. He said 80%. 80% of their tourism dollars go to promote Vermont maple syrup. Kind of makes sense. I mean, I've been to Vermont, beautiful state, not a lot of industry, but they have a lot of maple trees, and they do produce a lot of maple syrup. So from a branding standpoint, it was very smart. What do you think of when you think of Wisconsin? What does anybody think of? That's right. What do you think of Idaho? That's right. So they're very smart in terms of branding that and that type of thing. If you guys would like for me to talk a little bit about how we produce our maple syrup and that type of thing, I don't know how much time I have.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, my wife's not here with a hook. She's not close enough to kick me under the table either.
Still got time.
Okay, well,
I'll do this.
you do that. Yeah, if you do that, that'll be good. Now I keep going too. But there was a local family. Oh, let me just make one other point. You may have heard on here that they talked about Leesville in Jackson County. Well, Leesville was in Jackson County at one time, and sometime in the mid-1900s. Somebody here might know when, but it was sometime they brought it into Lawrence County. So that's why on here it says Jackson County, because it was, at one point it was in Jackson County. Our maple syrup, I was introduced to sugaring by a local family here in Lawrence County. And there was a fellow by the name of Joe Evans that worked for me. And anybody that knows Joe, he's a real energetic guy, super, super guy. And this time of the year, he'd get real excited. He'd want to get out of the office, early in many cases. And I said, well, why, where are you going? He said, oh man, we've got to collect the sap. And I said, well, how fun is that? And he goes, oh man, it's fun. And I said, well, take me through it, Joe. Tell me why it's so exciting. He says, you go to the tree and you get that bag that's full of sap, you put it in a 5-gallon bucket, and then you take it to a bigger tank, and you fill that up, and then you just go around the farm and you take it to the sugar house, and then you boil it down. Tell me the exciting part of it, And he goes, that is the exciting part. So I said, well, I'm going to have to check this out. So I went with him over to this farm, and it was exciting because I sat back and watched this very large family, big family, 6 boys in this family, all grown men. Then they have their families. And so you see this it's almost a lost social aspect of families and friends and neighbors coming together. And I thought that was pretty neat. And so it kind of intrigued me. And so that's one of the reasons my wife and I, we got into moving that direction to making maple syrup, And so we bought an evaporator from a producer up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and Jay Mellencamp and I built the sugar house. It's made of 33, actually it's more than that, but we bought 33-foot long poplar longs from a bison farm over in Washington County, and then we skinned them, we debarked them by hand using like a spade. My son Greg was going to the University of Montana in Missoula, and he was on summer break. And he had a friend, Matt, that just did not know if he passed, but he just took the Washington State bar, so he was still flipping burgers at the time. And I approached my son Greg and I said, hey, I'll tell you what, if you can talk Matt into coming back, I'll pay for you guys to fly back, and I'll feed you like kings, whatever you want. But I got a job for you. I need for you to skin these 33 logs. And so they took me up on the offer, and they came back, and in 3 days, and this was hot. It was really hot out and humid. In 3 days, they skinned all these logs. And Matt today, now he's a prosecuting attorney in Yakima, Washington. Today, he still threatens litigation against me for wrongful representation. So he says, I just can't believe that you roped me into that. I had no idea it was going to be so difficult. But anyway, I did happen to give them a few bucks when they got on the plane. But anyway, so we have this just beautiful structure on our farm. We are going to be building a fireplace on the west side of this. We don't have it built yet, but we do have the majority of the components. It's been custom made, the components, the flue and the damper and all that kind of thing, because it's going to be, as far as we know, it's going to be the largest fireplace in the United States. It'll have an opening of 10 feet, 5 inches wide, and 7 feet tall. So it's bigger in the sense of opening than the Old Faithful Inn. It's larger than the fireplace down at the West Baden, and it's also larger than the Vanderbilt's fireplace. So we found the plans. It's a Rumford fireplace, and we did find the plans, and the opening was 10 foot even and 7 feet tall. So I said, we're going to go 10 foot 5 inches. So that's another reason for us doing this as well, is our syrup, fortunately, has been juried in as an Indiana artisan product. It's the first and only one at the time, and there are other maple syrups that can be juried into the Indiana Artisan Program, which is a great, great program to promote Indiana artisans and to show the craftsmanship that we have throughout the state of Indiana. So our syrup has been juried in as an Indiana artisan product. We raise sorghum on our farm as well, and that too has been juried into this program. And one of the reasons we wanted to do this is because having a product that's an artisan product, it kind of helps give us a little bit more credibility when we go to a market, and not just a farmer's market, but just a market in general. And we've been very successful, fortunately, up in Chicago. And I try to encourage other Indiana producers. One of the things there's the certain mystique about Indiana. I don't think a lot of Hoosiers know this. I didn't know this. I didn't realize this. But there's a friend of mine by the name of Scott Hutchison from Purdue University, and he's a food writer. And he got a phone call from a gal from Chicago who's a pie maker. And she says, Scott, do you know where I can get some Indiana rhubarb? And he goes, well, yeah, I know some people that grow rhubarb, but you have rhubarb producers in Illinois. She said, no, you don't understand. I can get $2 more per pie if it's Indiana rhubarb. So Scott said, oh, okay. So there is a certain wholesomeness of something coming from Indiana. And I want to share that with everybody. You could capitalize on where you live, And so that's encouraging to us. And so being an Indiana artisan and going up to Chicago, I don't want to come across as though I'm bragging, folks, but I'm going to tell you a few of our customers, and we've picked these guys up just in a very short period of time. But the Chicago Ritz-Carlton now exclusively uses our syrup. They were using our syrup in just a in a maple vinaigrette that they were serving in a summer squash dish. And one of the things that we try to ask the chefs or the hotels or the restaurants to do with us is to cross-market our brand, because we want to be associated with some of these high-profile restaurants and high-profile chefs. And so if you go to the Ritz-Carlton, on their menu, it'll say summer squash salad, and it describes what's on it, and then it says Burton's maple vinaigrette. And that's what they used our maple syrup for. A lot of these chefs, because there's a huge local movement, people are becoming more and more conscious about where their food's coming from. Most of us think that the food that's on our plate is going to be coming from, within a 300-mile radius, and it's not. It's coming from like a 3,000-mile radius. The majority of our food is coming from 3,000-mile radius. And so there's been this huge movement for the last couple of years to try to buy local, go local. And that's another thing that we've capitalized on, because we would be considered local. And we had the Ritz-Carlton chefs, Chef Kevin Payne Chef Mark Payne and Kevin Irving, had asked my wife Angie and I to come up to the Ritz and give a talk to their staff about making maple syrup. And so we went up there, and boy, you talk about a fish out of water. I mean, but they treated us really great, and that was one of the most uncomfortable things, is because it was like Mr. and Mrs. Burton. I said, "Hey, don't worry about it. You don't have to open the door for me," and that kind of thing. And so we went in there, and we gave our talk and all that kind of thing. And then the chefs asked us, "Can we come down to your farm? We don't have to stay with you, but can we come down to your farm?" I said, "No, we got room upstairs. You can just stay up there." So these guys came down about 2 weeks ago. We hung some buckets and collected some sap that was hanging there, because it may have been 3 weeks ago, because it was really cold at the time. The sap really wasn't running that well. But then I took them to an Amish community around Orleans that I work with, and they just thought that was incredible. We went out and went pheasant hunting and chucker hunting. These two guys have never shot a shotgun. That was very fun to watch them. That was a lot of fun to watch them. I don't know how many times, and I just had my camera, and I don't know how many times we kicked up a pheasant. The pheasant was right there, and the chef went, never shot, And but then at the end of the day, they were, shooting away and that kind of thing. They were leaving at like 6 o'clock in the morning to get back up to the hotel. They stayed with us 2 nights, and they left. I thought, I set the alarms to wake up at about 5:45. I just wanted to say, guys, thanks for coming down and that kind of thing. I woke up and I didn't hear any movement upstairs, so I thought, well, they're not up there. Those guys are tuckered out, and then we're just going to have to wait for. So I just rested my eyes, and I woke up at about 6 o'clock, and I thought, well, I'm just going to get up. And I got up. They were gone already, and they left a message. And I said to my wife, oh my goodness, you can take this one of 2 ways. They said, Tim and Angie, thank you so much for your hospitality. We know what Hoosier Hospitality is all about now, and this has definitely been a life-changing experience. I think it was good, because I got a call that same day. These guys were so tired when they left, and then they had the 5.5-hour drive, 6-hour drive back. Then they were at work. I got a call from them, and they said it was Kevin Irving. And Kevin said to me, he said, "Mark and I have been talking about this. We're going to implement Burton's Maplewood Farms syrup is exclusively going to be used at the Ritz-Carlton now for all of the 3 restaurants and all of room service and that type of thing." So again, it's just a matter of opening your doors and inviting them in, because these chefs really want to get to know the farmer. And it's about, the motto up there at the market is know your food, know your farmer. There's another high-profile chef up there by the name of Rick Bayless. And Rick owns several restaurants, but ones he's known for is Frontera Grill, and he also has this one called Shoko's. And I was delivering some syrup one day, and he told me, he said, "You know what, Tim, 25 years ago, we as chefs were trying to get ingredients as far away from our restaurants as we could possibly get it, Madagascar or wherever, and it's done a complete 180. We now want to get food as close to our back door as possible." So this is a huge trend that's happening, and it's a great opportunity. This is a featured article that was in the Edible Chicago magazine, and this is something that goes out to a lot of people that they call foodies, people that are really into, food and where it comes from and that kind of thing. And so this has really done a lot for our brand, our syrup, and that kind of thing. And I'll just pass that around. But several other restaurants that use us is Publican and Blackbird. Are you guys familiar with like the John Hancock building, the Signature Room? It's one of the tallest buildings in Chicago. They have a restaurant at the very top called the Signature Room, and Chef Patrick Sheeran, they use our syrup up there, which is kind of cool. You're driving into Chicago and you go, they use our stuff right up there. It's pretty neat. But anyway, let's see, our farm is about 30 acres, give or take an acre or two, and we tap about 600-700 trees. Most of them have 2 taps in each tree. Some have 3, some have only 1. We try to only tap a tree that's 14 inches in diameter or less, and then typically we'll add another tap for every 4 inches. So if it's 18 inches, we'll put 2 taps in it. There's, as you heard on the audio, the Native American Indians first discovered maple syrup, and they would score a tree, and then they would actually put a reed in that score, and then it would drop into a bowl. There's several stories about how they even discovered pure maple syrup, and the most common one that I've heard is of an Indian woman who was going to prepare their meal for the evening, and midday she took a venison roast and had it in like a wooden bowl, and she put it next to a maple tree, and she was going to go down to the creek to fetch water to boil this venison roast. When she put it there, and then her husband came back into camp and took his tomahawks, and he put it into the tree, and that opened it up, and then that maple sap ran down into that bowl. So when she came back out, she thought that someone had already put the water in there. She went ahead and went to cook this, and when she reduced it, they found that it made the venison just a wonderful sweet flavor. And that's the most common story about how maple syrup was made. And then Europeans started to come over, and the Indians showed them how it was done. And there's been there's been a lot of different, there's the white man, when he came over, he started to kind of develop other ways to extract the sap, but it's still all quite primitive. They created these taps, and this is a tap that goes back to the mid-1800s, and I'm going to pass this around. This is from the mid-1800s. That's the type of tap that they would whittle out. This is another wooden spile. These are called spiles or taps, referred to as taps. And this one is also a very old tap.
So the hooks for hanging the bucket?
Hooks for hanging the bucket. Mm-hmm.
And which, the whole end is on the one out of the tree or in the tree?
The very narrow one goes into the tree. Yeah, it goes into the tree. And then as they've industrialized some things, they started casting taps. And this is a little bit different design from that. And then they came out with like other different types of tap designs. And this is the most common one that we use on our farm. It's just a plastic spile that we use. And one of the biggest advancements in making maple syrup, or collecting sap, not making maple syrup, but collecting sap, is a system for which they take tubing like this. And they'll actually, we can tap the tree and put this in, and these are called health spiles. And the reason they call it health spiles is because you're not drilling into the tree or making quite the opening into a tree, so they call it a health spile. A lot of people say, well, are you harming a tree when you cut into it, when you drill into it? And my opinion is, no, you're not harming it. And you could talk to somebody else and they say, well, absolutely, you're harming it. But I feel that we're taking so little sap out of the tree that it's not going to make a difference. I mean, we're taking a minute amount out of it. But a tree is very much like a human being is. Whenever you get a cut or a wound, your body from that very point starts the process of healing. And a maple or any tree, when you cut into it, it starts the process immediately to try to scab over or heal itself up. That's one of the reasons they call that a health spile, because if you notice the spile size or the diameter of this is not as big. And again, the larger the wound is on us, the more susceptible we are to infection. And that's the same way with this. You're more susceptible to infection. When we drill into a tree, we're only drilling into a tree maybe an inch to 2 inches, something like that. If you see the rings on here, look at the rings on that. That's as far as we're going. We're not going very far. And the area that we're tapping into of the tree is called the cambium layer of the tree. And the cambium layer is just a little bit past the bark. We're not going into the hardwood because sap doesn't flow in the hardwood. It only flows on the outside. And the reason for, I don't think these have been over here, have they? No. The reason that the maple tree has, all trees have sap, but it's the maple tree that has the highest sugar content and the most volume during the very early spring. And the reason that this occurs is the sap is down in the root system, and it's actually flowing up to the upper canopy, the outer extremities of the tree, taking nutrition out to the outer extremities. Again, like a human body. You know, we have these capillaries and all that kind of thing, and so the blood flows through our bodies, and then it goes back to our heart. Well, that's exactly what happens to a tree. The sap is flowing up to the outer extremities, and it's taking that nutrition out there so that it can create these buds. And then when it gets real cold at night, it goes back down into the root system. So what we're doing is we're trying to capture as much as we can at that time. And so we're always, as producers, we're always looking for cold nights, as cold as possible, and then an extreme change in temperatures. And the ideal situation was last weekend, on Saturday. The Flynns tapped our ceremonial tree. And when Ralph Flynn tapped it, I don't think I've ever seen a tree, it almost poured out. It didn't just drip out, it almost poured out. It was amazing because we had a night that was 22 degrees, and that day it shot up all the way to, I think it was like 53 degrees. So needless to say, I hugged the tree and told her how well she was doing and that kind of thing. And the guys from Chicago were just kind of looking at me. They didn't stick around very much longer after that. No, they did. They actually wanted to get a picture of it, and I said, no. But anyway, I did. I don't want to offend any of the ladies here, but I did refer to the tree as her. And I said, "You're doing all right, girl. Keep going." And that's okay because it is Mother Nature that does this for us. But anyway, it was unbelievable how well the sap was running that day. So that's the reason that. And then we collect the sap. The sap is only at 2% sugar content when we bring it in. Typically, that's average. It could be less, and sometimes it could be more. That tree that the Flynns tapped, when I took the sap reading on that, the sugar reading on that, it's 4% sugar. Now today I can go there and it might be 2%. I don't know exactly why, other than that it was richer in sugar at that time. By the time we reduce the sap to maple syrup, it's up to 63% sugar. So we're going from 2% to 63%, and the reason, the way we get there is just through reduction, because we boil it, and then we boil it, and we boil it some more. We keep boiling it until we reduce it to that 63%. And that's one of the reasons pure maple syrup is so darn expensive, is because I elected to use fuel oil in our evaporator, because I'm not Amish and I can't spend all that time in the woods cutting. But I have some great Amish friends that literally have a room this size and it's stuffed with wood before the season starts. It's probably bigger than this room, and they have it stuffed with wood. So it just makes more sense for Angie and I to use fuel oil than it does wood. So I have these fixed costs into my syrup, into our syrup, than maybe the Amish, because the Amish look at it as just, they don't factor in their time or that fuel into it, and we have to. So that's why you might see a big fluctuation also from one producer to another. It just depends on how they're factoring their costs in and that type of thing. We have different ways of measuring the sugar content. What we use is a hydrometer. And a hydrometer, there's two different types of hydrometers. There's a syrup hydrometer, which is this one right here. And there's a sap hydrometer, which reads a much lower reading. And what we basically do, the hydrometer for the sap looks very much like this. What we'll do is we'll take the sap and we'll fill this up, and then we'll drop this in. And like a bobber, it'll go up and down. And the temperature has to be a certain temperature. And then we'll look at the reading here, and it'll tell us whether it's 1.5, 2%, 2.5, 3%, and that type of thing. And that's how we'll measure that. We buy sap from many different farmers because we just don't have enough trees to produce the amount of syrup to fulfill the orders for our customers and that type of thing. So we do buy sap. A couple of years ago, syrup was through the roof, which reflected on the price that we were going to be paying for the sap. We were paying as much as 50 cents a gallon for sap. And it takes 40 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of syrup at 2% sugar. So, you start figuring that out. You have a lot of money just wrapped up into the sap. And sap I look at sap in terms of its spoilage, very much like milk. It's very much like milk. If you keep milk nice and cold, you can keep it for a while. But once it starts to get warm, then sap starts to ferment, where milk starts to spoil, and there becomes an off taste. So we always try to boil off our sap that we collect. But leading up to the festival last week, we had some great runs, and we were able to just hold on to the sap because it was so cold outside. As the season progresses, the sap property starts to change a little bit. And there's different grades of maple syrup. The Food and Drug Administration has 5 different grades of maple syrup. There's A grade, there's B grade, and then there's commercial grade. Now you see I have 3 fingers up for A grade because there's 3 subgrades in the A grade. There's A grade light medium, or light amber, there's A grade medium amber, and then there's A grade dark amber. So those are the subgrades in A grade. And that's taste and its color that determines what those grades are. And there's a scale that you can follow. It's almost like a color swatch. You can look at that and see that light amber, medium amber, dark amber. And then it jumps right over to a different grade. Jumps right over to a B grade. And B grade is more robust. It's more mapley. It's a deeper mapley kind of earthy flavor. And B grade is what most of our customers will use, most of our chefs will use in their dish because the maple flavor really comes through the dish. And then the A grade is typically a lighter, more perfumey kind of flavor that's typically used on crepes and French toast and pancakes and that kind of thing. But that's not to say that you can't use B grade on, on pancakes and that kind of thing. Some people will say to me, well, which one's better? Well, neither one's better. It's what your preference is. It's like saying which wine's better. Some people like a white Zinfandel. Some people like a blush. So is one better than the other? No, it's just personal preference. And so that's the way it is with those grades, the B grade. And the medical community has found that the B grade actually has more antioxidants in it. And what changes and makes it a B grade is later in the season, as the buds start to come out, producers call that a buddy or a budding flavor, budding taste. The flavor starts to change to give it that robust flavor. And so that's your B grade. And then the last grade is commercial grade. And it's an off flavor, it's an off taste. It's not a table-worthy grade. It's terrible. It's not very good at all. It gets to the point that it even becomes stringy. And I remember one year, it was so late in the season, and we were taking in the sap, and it was starting to turn. Typically, when you get sap, you can't tell the difference between sap or tap water. I mean, it's crystal clear. You can't tell the difference. And when you taste it, you can barely pick up on a little sugarness. But we started collecting the sap, and it was kind of warm outside, and it started to cloud pretty quick. So I just kept cooking it. and then started getting this terrible taste in the syrup. And I thought, oh, this is just a waste of fuel. But I put it in the buckets and kept going. I talked to a fellow, Bruce Bascom from New Hampshire, and I said, hey, Bruce, I've got this syrup, and I just have to tell you, it's not very good. It doesn't taste very good. He said, send it back to me. I'll buy it. And I did, and he didn't knock very much off the price of what A or B goes for. It was amazing. I said, what are you guys doing with that? He says, we broker it out and we sell it to either food companies that will put it into like flavored corn. It's flavored corn syrup. That's what Aunt Jemima, well, I don't want to, this is being recorded, isn't it? Several popular brands. Can you rewind that and redo that? But anyway, they'll actually, because the FDA only requires that 1% pure maple syrup has to go into that bottle of corn syrup, and they can actually label it made with pure syrup or natural syrup and that type of thing. And that's all they have to put in there. If you want to know that you're getting pure 100% pure maple syrup, it has to say on there, or it will say on there, 100% pure maple syrup. If it doesn't say 100% pure maple syrup, it's not pure maple syrup. If you look on the ingredients, and it starts out with corn syrup, and I hope I don't upset any farmers here that produce a lot of corn, but I was brought up on that. I was brought up on log cabin and Aunt Jemima and all that kind of thing. And so the first time you're exposed to pure maple syrup, you go, gosh, why is it so runny? It's not that thick stuff that we like. But anyway, our B grade's pretty popular up in Chicago, and it's for that reason. It's because that maple flavor really, really comes through. We started the National Maple Syrup Festival because it was about the time that Angie and I started getting into making maple syrup. And my sister, Kelly, and my brother-in-law, Kenny Turner, started the Heads Up Foundation. And the Heads Up Foundation was started because their daughter, our niece, Caitlin, was born with a unilateral cleft lip and palate. I was born with a cleft lip myself. And they transported Katie to Riley Hospital for Children. And it's amazing what Riley does, But the thing of it is that when Caitlin was born, there was no documentation to give a parent and say, don't worry, this can be taken care of, plastic surgery. There was nothing they can actually have in their hand to look at, to say, to put their mind at ease. Because I don't know if anybody's familiar with cleft lip and palate, but it's a very traumatic looking anomaly. And I just had a cleft lip. Caitlin had a cleft lip and palate. So they wanted to start the Heads Up Foundation. And so we were looking for ways to raise money for the foundation. And we have been pretty successful at collecting empty inkjet and toner cartridges around the state. The Indianapolis Colts contribute with all their empty cartridges, Roche Pharmaceuticals. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. A lot of great Indiana corporations have given their empty cartridges to us. But the cartridge market has really tumbled. It's really fallen. And so obviously there's not quite the revenue in these empty cartridges. So we as a family kind of came together and said, why don't we do a maple syrup festival? How about if we do the Medora Maple Festival? Let's go big. How about the Jackson County Maple Syrup Festival? And we got thinking, I wonder if there's an Indiana Maple Syrup Festival. Googled it. No Indiana Maple Syrup Festival, so we're good. And then just surely Vermont has the National Maple Syrup Festival. Nothing. There's nothing there. So what we did is we went through the U.S. Department of Trademark and Copyright, and we have the name National Maple Syrup Festival is copywritten and trademarked and that kind of thing. Because we figured when those folks in Vermont found out that we were claiming to be the national, we were probably going to, there was going to be a big battle over that. But anyway, so we started the National Maple Syrup Festival. And I'm very proud of that. I'm proud because maple syrup goes back in my wife's family 200 years. Indiana led the nation in maple syrup production in 1916. Hey, there's no reason we can't say that, why can't we be the National Maple Syrup Festival? Our location is another really neat thing, I feel, from a marketing standpoint. We talked a little bit about carbon footprint and where your food comes from. Indiana is positioned on the southwest edge of the Maple Belt. That's not to say that they don't make any maple syrup in Illinois or Kentucky. They do, but they're very, very small, typically hobby farms and things like that. So Indiana really is the edge of the western fringe of the Maple Belt. We don't have any interest in going east into the Maple Belt, but what we do have interest in doing is developing the relationships that we have in a culinary hotbed like Chicago, and then from there going west. Because most of the folks out west, especially on the West Coast, they want to limit their carbon footprint for where that food's coming from. So we feel that we have some appeal to these restaurants that are on the West Coast by saying, hey, we're the closest source of maple syrup to you. You start to get into a little debate when you go up the West Coast, up into Portland and that area, because Minnesota does produce maple syrup as well. So let's see, does anybody have any questions? Yes?
I have two observations and a question. First of all, I saw your festival mentioned in Midwest Living here. I just looked through the book yesterday.
Oh, yeah?
In the category for festivals this month. Also, my daughter lives in Indianapolis, does a lot of local board type buying markets, and she has some poplar syrup from the poplar tree. I haven't tasted it yet, don't know what it's like. And then with these files, do you always stick it back in the same hole, or does it heal up and you have to find another hole with it?
That's a good question. It will heal up. It'll heal up, and so each year we have to drill a new hole. And we always drill to the side, but we never drill above or below, because the flow of the sap is going this way. And we also always make sure that we do not drill above or below a scar on a tree. We also look above and look at the canopy to see what the health of the tree's like. If we see that the tree's if there's a lot of stress to the tree, and now I say this, and some of you are going to come to my farm and go, wait, Tim, that looks like there's some stress up there, and you've got a bucket hanging off of it. I do have one tree that I kind of went, do I or don't I? But it's right when you come into our driveway. It's kind of like an island, and it is stressed out a little bit at the top, and I did hang a bucket on it, so I kind of contradicted myself a little bit on that. But we typically try not to tap a tree that we see is under stress. And I think that tree is under stress not because of tapping, it's because of its location. We've had some real heavy equipment in there to build the sugar house and that kind of thing. And as most of you know, when you put a lot of stress on the root system, you're putting a tremendous amount of stress on that tree, and you could lose it, whether it be digging or whether it's just heavy equipment on it. Yes?
Do you tap the trees every year, the same trees every year?
We do. We do.
Well, I don't know. Some of us probably know the Brocks out in Williams. They're hobbyists, and they've got two grows, and they go from one to the other year to year. And I was wondering if that was necessary.
Well, I would say it just depends on what your philosophy is on that. That's not a wrong thing to do. It's certainly not. But for example, we only tap 14 inches or more. If you go to an Amish farm, I see 2 bags hanging off a maple tree that's that big, But we just don't, because that's just our personal thought, let's not put too much stress on that tree, because we want it to be sustainable. That's another great thing about mapling or sugaring is that it's a sustainable product. The country was actually, it's really interesting, the United States, during the Civil War, the North actually, to defy the South, cut off cane sugar and said, you know what, we're just going to do maple sugar. And it was to defy slavery, because most of that cane sugar that was coming up was slave labor. So the North said, you know what, we don't need your cane sugar. Don't need it because we've got our own sustainable resource here. Yes?
You may have said earlier, and I missed it, is it the soft maple and the hard maple, or is it just the hard maple that you get the sap from?
We pull from both. Those are the most two common. There's other maples besides that as well. The soft maple produces more sap, but the sugar content typically is a little bit less. Might be 1.5, 1.6, maybe a little less than that. The hard maple, on the other hand, produces less volume, but a higher sugar content. The tree that the Flynns tapped on my farm was a hard maple, and so it was really high up there. And I'm hoping to get my hands on some seedling maples that were developed by Cornell University. And I've been told that these maples that they grafted back in the 1960s will yield a sugar content as high as 8%. So I'd like to get some of those and plant those on our farm for future generations for them to... typically 14 to 18 years, something like that, before they're to 14 inches. Yeah. And then the boreal forest up in Minnesota, the boreal forest tends to yield a higher content in their sugar content in their maples. I don't know why. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's just a lot of people ask that question as well. Well, what makes the sugar sweeter? And I feel good that I can say it. You know what? I don't know. But the reason I say I feel good about that is because I've talked to people that have been doing it for generations on end, and they don't know. So it makes me feel like, okay, good. I'm yeah, I'm keeping up. And that's the neat thing about making maple syrup. There are so many variables. There's a fella, gentleman here in Lawrence County. His first name's Cecil. And I asked Cecil one day, I said, Cecil, you've been doing this for a long time. He says, yes, I have. And I said, can you tell me, have you ever seen a run? A run means that the trees are just flowing. Have you ever seen a long run? He says, yep. One time I saw a run which went for like 48 hours. Because typically at night it does get cold, and so the trees stop running. But he said that the conditions were just right. But I asked him, I said, well, why was that? He said, I don't know. There's not a one answer, a right answer to all, because there's so many different variables. There's the barometric pressures, there's the temperature, the sun. The sun affects how well your sap runs. We try to tap the south-facing side of our trees because the sun is going to be coming up. It's going to warm up that side of the tree first, so it'll open it up. Yeah. Any other questions? Does anybody? Yes?
I had a question about the Leesville massacre because I don't know anything about that.
Okay.
Now, since Jacob came back, Jacob Flynn came back, and you said he came back home, that means the home was still there. So how big a group was this of the Native Americans who attacked, and how many people besides these three in the picture ended up being affected by this?
I don't know all the details, and Ron, if you have any information on this, speak up. Ron, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, Ron, but Ron is who I got this book from.
I should say, which of his children were you descended from, and how many children did he still have who didn't end up obviously getting?
I can't tell you right.
Okay, that's fair enough.
But he had quite a few kids, didn't he, Ron?
Yes, he did. The Granny White House, I believe, is where the massacre actually occurred. The one that's down in Spring Mill. People here are familiar with that, I'm satisfied. And she was a person that had been very kind to the Indians and let them stay there at her place. And for some reason, as Tim said, there was a lot of bad things went on with the white people had done to the Indians, but they left her alone. And but for some reason, something snapped, and the Flynn's were there, and they got the brunt of it. And Jacob was lucky enough, or unlucky enough, whichever way you want to look at it, to be the one that happened to, and then he escaped. But now, as far as which son I'm from, I don't know.
But he still had family who were not affected by this. I mean, family that stayed in Leesville. Like was he married? Yeah. So when he came back to his family, and they were not affected by. Nobody.
He didn't know that his son, well, obviously his son was scalped, and so he probably figured that he was probably mortally wounded, although you could be scalped and still make it, from what I understand, but he didn't realize that when he left, or when he was taken. But
He didn't know his child was alive or dead, did he?
No, when he left, he didn't. But Elizabeth Guthrie actually talks about Elizabeth showed a tremendous amount of bravery by coming out of the blockhouse and helping her husband. He was kind of known as a really strong, linky man, and when he was shot, he thought he actually was hit by a limb because they were falling a tree. So when he was shot, he didn't realize he was shot through the breast. And then he realized it, and he was making his way to the blockhouse, and Elizabeth actually ran out. Elizabeth is Jacob's daughter, one of his older daughters. And she came out and helped him. And the Spears is another family name that was very common back then.
And so there was no effort to destroy the whole settlement. They just took their hostage and killed a few people and left.
Right. Killed one person that I know
Killed
of.
one and mortally wounded a second.
No. The Guthrie man made it.
Oh, he made it.
He made it through the attack. The only one that was actually mortally wounded was the son.
So it was these three guys, basically.
Yes, and that is a depiction. Obviously, they didn't have cameras or anything like that back then, but yeah. Any other questions?
Did he show them the Indian? Somebody said that they couldn't quite see the Indian.
Oh, sure, yeah. Here they are. Here's one right here, and here's the feathers you can see of the other ones kind of sneaking up behind them. But
So they think it was just a couple of Indians?
no, the reading that I've had, it doesn't say 1, 2, 3, or 4, and I would say it would be several. I don't think it would have been just 2 or anything like that. But something I have to say that everybody here should be very proud of. I've spent several hours here, and a lot of this information. Ron turned me on to this story with the book that he has that he loaned to me, and then I came in and started going through the archives, and it's just, I wonder if people realize how much the wealth of information that's here.
Some people do.
Yeah, I mean, it's just,
You didn't acquire here.
it was unbelievable. I just kind of felt, it was just incredible to be able to go back. My company also sustains Lawrence County's IT infrastructure. We maintain all the technology for the courthouse and over the sheriff's department and that type of thing. And went down into the basement of the courthouse, and one room over is where we had our servers and for our computers and things like that. When the room next to it, it was under lock and key, and they opened that up for us, and we went in there, and there were all these books on their sides, all these books, and I'm looking, it says 18 such and such, 18. And then all of a sudden I get down to this little tiny book, and it's there, and I take it out, and then I see the date on it, and I'm going, I shouldn't even be handling this, because it's just so old. It was unbelievable. I can't tell you exactly the date, but it was like when Lawrence County was first platted. It was unreal. And I looked at that. I felt so privileged to just be there, It was kind of like when my wife and I took our kids and my nephew to Washington, D. on a trip, and I think the most compelling sight that we saw was the preambles and the Declaration of Independence, and it was right there. It was just like, man, that our nation, that's the foundation of our nation. Right there is. So it's pretty amazing whenever I see a historical document like that. So, any other questions? And I would like to point out my mother-in-law and my wife over here. Donna, can you stand up? This is payback. She doesn't like to be recognized, but I'm kind of forcing her to stand up here. But Donna, her mother is also Catherine's sister, and so Donna is Jacob Flynn's great-great-great-granddaughter, just as Ron's the 4th generation of Jacob on. And then my wife Angie is Jacob Flynn's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. So I thank them for having such rich heritage and, all that kind of thing.
Well, thank you very much. That was really
You're welcome.